Thanks for coming back to the latest episode of the Credit Clubhouse. We are your one-stop shop for all things credit. Before we jump into our next episode, we have an exclusive offer for our listeners. If you're interested in attending any of our conferences throughout the year, we have a great deal for you. Just head to www.DealCatalyst.io, pick the event you want to attend, and enter the promo code CREDIT at checkout. This will give you 10% off any ticket to any conference. As always, don't forget to follow the show, rate us, and leave a review. We encourage your feedback. It'll help us make these episodes a better listen for you. And now, on to our next episode. Welcome back to the latest installment of the Credit Clubhouse. As always, I'm your host, Todd Anderson, head of content and programming at DealCatalyst. Joining me today is Mike Consedine, Executive Vice President and Global Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Athene. Mike, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually at least. How are you doing? And thank you for your time today.
Oh, Todd, it's great to be with you, doing fine, and looking forward to our conversation.
All right. Well, earlier this year, your former employer, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, or the NAIC, where you served as commissioner or served as CEO, from 2017 to 2023, launched a risk-based capital task force to improve governance. And I believe on LinkedIn, or maybe in a release, I saw you say this was a bold leap forward. If you can maybe give a little context as to why that is, and a little bit of more information around that release that they did.
Sure. Well, maybe before I answer the question, I'll give a little bit more context on what the NAIC is, because I'm not sure how many of your listeners are familiar with the arcana of insurance regulation. So, as you said, the NAIC is the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. It is not a regulator, but it is a U.S. standard-setting body that actually is over 150 years old and was created to really coordinate our state-based insurance system here. Every state and territory in the U.S. has a state insurance commissioner, superintendent, or director who is in charge of regulating their state market. Of course, it's now 150 years later, it's expanded to a global business. So you need a body that can help coordinate across state lines and now across international lines. So the NAIC was born to kind of as a coordinating body. It has grown into a standard-setting entity. It's actually a huge technology company because it provides a lot of the back office technology that coordinate and connect state insurance departments. So it has a very important role, particularly in that standard setting. So they promulgate rules, standard or model rules, regulations, bulletins that go out. A lot of them are immediately adopted by the state insurance commissioners. Some have to go through the legislative process. But this is a body, particularly now, that has a lot of impact on our market space, both insurance and increasingly asset management. As we'll talk about, a better part of the real economy is now sitting with life insurers instead of banks. And so this body based in Kansas City with offices in DC and New York has a lot of influence. And so when we talked about this committee, executive committee that they set up, which is an important move on their part to deal with risk-based capital, particularly how RBC should be adapted and how it will be evolved going forward, given the transformation that we're seeing here in the US and increasingly internationally, sort of this intersection between asset management and life insurers, which is changing how life insurers invest, how they utilize asset-intensive reinsurance, and how they act in terms of their role in the larger economy. So the NAIC and state insurance regulators very focused on this. And they released sort of this new framework, which laid out, their vision for RBC, which is sort of, our solvency foundation here in the U.S. in terms of what insurance companies have to hold in terms of capital and reserves. So very important. It's, sort of our equivalent to Solvency II or Basel III. But it's being adapted. And what the regulators have said is, here are the principles that we're going to use. that are going to guide that adaptation going forward. And some really important stuff in there. It's going to be, much more driven by sort of a policy lens. They recognize the role the life sector plays now in the economy. It's going to sort of weigh technical decisions against the need for capital in the marketplace, the need for life insurers to protect American consumers. And so, it kind of, sets the stage for this next, I'd say, RBC 2.0, and how that plays out and the way it plays out, will have a really significant impact on both life insurers and asset managers, and will be looked at by global regulators as potentially, a model for them to follow. And from what we've seen so far, it's a good start. It basically moves, capital regulation from the engine room to the boardroom, and that's a good thing for all of us.
Can you speak to maybe some of the other regulatory changes that are taking place? I think there's maybe is a bit of a misnomer or bad assumption that, when a new administration comes in, especially one that might be prone to try to at least limit new regulatory issues or try to, limit the regulatory burden, so to speak, that regulation stops or regulation is then, removed. Is that a misnomer? What does that really mean when they say it? Because obviously regulation is a huge part of financial services and insurance.
True. And usually you're absolutely right. People look to what's happening in DC and Congress as a key bellwether of how it's going to impact their particular industry. And that's generally true of insurance to a degree. But as as we just talked about, our system is unique in that it's a state-based system. So some of the action happens in DC, but a lot of it happens at a state level. So, while you have the potential for, continued congressional gridlock, you've got sort of agencies taking action, both in terms of at the federal level, deregulation and changes. Some of that will impact the insurance sector. Tax, for example, huge issue right now for us. We've got a tax bill going through Congress, and like everybody, that will impact the insurance sector. We also are looking at changes in some of the agencies that really matter to us with the Department of Labor, SEC. For us at Athene and Apollo, we're looking at how we can sort of get into the DC plan space, with annuity products so that American consumers, when they're actually, ready to retire, have a product that meets their needs at that point in terms of providing guaranteed income. That's a huge deal for the industry, and again, something that will have to go through the federal process. But as I also said, a lot of it is we're focused very much on what's happening at the state. And increasingly, we're focused on what's happening internationally. One of the big changes that we experienced coming out of the financial crisis was international standard setting bodies, like the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, IAIS. You'll hear me probably refer to them. It's kind of like a Basel committee for insurance, does, focuses on insurance, has increased significance in terms of it too is a standard setting body. So it's out there kind of looking at this new regulatory landscape and adopting, sort of global standards that have a way of trickling down to local jurisdictions. So we're very involved there. But in terms of DC, we see issues around, retirement security as something that should hopefully attract, bipartisan support. I mean, we're talking about the livelihood and security of American consumers and retirees, and hopefully, like, mom, apple pie, and baseball, it's something everybody can get their arms around. So.
Let's hope so. Yeah, you sat on both sides of the table. You were at the NAIC. You're obviously at Athene now. What is the exchange between, an organization like NAIC and market players like Athene look like? And does that exchange increase, decrease as times of stress? I mean, we had a pretty volatile start to the year. Do they field more calls? Do you guys have more conversations? What does some of that look like, from your position?
Yeah, well, ironically, I'm sitting here in our office in Hamilton, Bermuda, because our Iowa supervisor is hosting a supervisory college. It's not as fun as it sounds. It's just basically a gathering of our regulators globally to kind of meet with the company, talk about, what's happening, and, have kind of a regulator to regulator session after we're done reporting out. That is an example of a kind of a process that was implemented after the last financial crisis, because one of the lessons learned was at both the regulator level, and I was a regulator during that period of time, is we needed better communication, especially in times of crisis. We needed more transparency from our companies. We needed to have a better understanding of, where they are, what their, game book was for times of crisis. And all of that, has been implemented since 2008. So you see a lot more communication. We have ongoing lines of communication between our regulator in Iowa and Bermuda. We communicate with regulators globally on topics of interest. I think they're hungry for transparency, for data, for information. That is the fuel for effective regulation now is transparency and data, and they are after a lot of it. And as you mentioned, we've gone through a couple sort of since 2008, certainly significant tests of our system, of the implementation of those lessons learned. And by and large, it's served us really well. Our mantra, our philosophy at Athene is absolute transparency with our regulator, no surprises, hopefully little to no drama. And I think that has served us, really well. We have a high degree of regulatory credibility. So, it's an environment that has learned and adapted from, sort of lessons learned in the past. I think we're better for it. And I guess nobody wishes for another real, crisis, but if one happens, I think, sort of the lines of communication and the mechanisms are in place to allow us to get through it effectively.
Your title is global head of government and regulatory affairs. Practically speaking, what does that mean? And maybe when giving us a little more color, obviously, to your role, what does Athene look like today as an organization? I think people know the name, they know it's associated with Paulo, but maybe just a little bit of a reset on kind of who Athene is today.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm on the road a lot, much to my family's dismay, but that is a function of a global business that we're in, and Athene Apollo's, place in increasingly, a global business that we have at an insurance level. Um, I would say, for Athene, it has been a real story of growth. I was not around at the company's founding, but I was around as a regulator during that time. And I remember, you started to hear the name Athene and Apollo. And, it was in the context of, hey, something is happening in the life sector, which is, trust me, as a regulator, you know, traditionally and historically, the life sector was a pretty boring place. But all of a sudden, maybe 10 years ago, it started getting really interesting and mostly associated with this combination of asset management and life insurance, which, Athene is largely responsible for that model. And, over the course of the time, it has really grown. Number one provider of fixed indexed annuity. We're channeling billions, if not more, into the real economy through that model. It's a company, as I said, that I'm really proud to be a part of because it is really committed to our consumers, our customers. I mean, we are in this for the long haul. B, it's really committed to the regulatory environment. Our CEO, Mark Rowan, and our leadership at Athene all recognize the importance that regulation plays. They want to be sort of a thoughtful voice in it because they recognize, even as a regulator, I didn't really understand a lot of what was happening, on this asset management side. So it's incumbent upon us in the industry, especially the leaders in the industry, to be engaged with the regulators to dispel misconceptions, particularly around, private credit versus public credit and sort of, why we're in Bermuda, questions that come up pretty frequently, still coming up. And also just, demonstrate that, we're committed to sound, effective regulation, not necessarily more regulation, but just effective regulation. And a good part of my job is being out there along with an incredible team at Athene and Apollo, just educating, advocating, and being part of this transformation that we find ourselves in.
Obviously, one of the most common themes that I've seen throughout this podcast is, the conversation around access to insurance capital. And so I'm curious to get your take on kind of why that demand has taken off, and with that demand, kind of what increased risks might come along with it.
Right. So, I mean, for Athene, capital is a huge part of the solution to meeting a need of American retirees in providing guaranteed products. And this is something I didn't have a real appreciation for, as a regulator, and part of what we're doing now is really educating insurance regulators on the relationship between capital in the marketplace and our ability as an industry to solve for this retirement crisis. And access to capital, the need for capital has been, incredibly limited, really up until sort of Athene and Apollo developed this model, which, turned is essentially a capital formation flywheel and generates the capital that we need, and others have replicated that model, and so that, they need to be able to provide these products at a time, when American consumers really need them. We've got a ballooning, retiree population in the U.S. Pensions are down, annuity demand is up. And so you have to have capital in place to meet that. And again, our model matches long-term assets with long-term liabilities. It's a situation where, everybody wins if done prudently and thoughtfully with a great deal of discipline, all of which we have at Athene and Apollo. But your question is, the risk is well taken, and a good part of the conversations we continue to have with regulators is around those risks, real and perceived. And I think, part of the story is, again, how we do it, how we manage our investments. Apollo's significant resources in being able to generate those assets directly and those investments directly. The resources we have to make sure that the investments are prudent and reasonable. But not every company, has the same resources and expertise we do. We see a lot of people coming in, or a lot of companies coming into the space with, little to no experience on either asset management or insurance, and that worries us. We see companies going to jurisdictions where the level of regulation, allows for capital regulatory arbitrage, also concerning to us. So you do see, cause for concern, and we do see the need for adapted regulation, but we don't see the need for, a full-on, concern about sort of private credit. I think a large part of what we've been educating regulators and policymakers about is, what private credit is and isn't, and how it matches up against public credit. There's this sort of outdated notion that, public is safe and private is risky, and that's just simply not true anymore. I mean, public and private are both safe and risky. And our CEO, Mark Rohn, has talked a great deal about this. And that said, we're still out there educating the regulators. And so I think, part of the risk is also looking forward is, how will the regulatory environment adapt to what's going on? Will they overact? Will they become prescriptive? Or will they be, as I think the NAIC is doing, taking sort of a thoughtful, principle-based approach? So, those are some of the things that we see in play in this new game board here.
Where do you see maybe some of the greatest opportunities for insurance capital to play a bigger role than it already has?
Yeah, great question. And a good part of our time has probably been focused on some of those jurisdictions. The private credit transformation and evolution is really centered here in the U.S. And the reason for that is, after sort of the last financial crisis, as banks had to take a step back because of, capital restrictions in terms of their ability to finance and invest. Insurance companies, life insurance companies specifically, were able to step forward because our regulatory regime in the U.S. has long allowed life insurers to sort of invest in long-term investments. And, that served us well. So we've seen this corresponding growth of private credit here in the U.S., in which life insurers, are increasingly significant investors in. You look, though, at places, like Europe, where they just hold a fraction of sort of the non-governmental debt versus what we do here in the U.S. And that's primarily because their solvency regime in Europe, Solvency II, is much more sort of prescriptive and penalizes sort of life insurer long-term investments to a degree. And that has kind of limited their role of the life insurance companies in Europe in terms of those investments. Also, they've got some fairly prescriptive regulation around securitization. Point being, all of that's starting to be reevaluated. We've had a lot of discussions with European policymakers and regulators. They look at the U.S. market. As one economist was titled, we are the envy of the globe in terms of our economy, and that does not go unnoticed. So they're looking at what's your secret sauce here, and and increasingly they're figuring out, it's the role of private credit is a big part of that. How do we sort of tap into that in Europe and even in Asia? We're having those discussions. And so I think you're going to see increasing, and you've seen already, Europe has proposed major changes to securitization.
Yeah.
They're looking at even at changes to Solvency II, which, I didn't think I'd live to see the day where Solvency II, capital standards were potentially adjusted. I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing. And, somebody who's worked a good part of his career and lived in Europe, you want to see a vibrant European economy. They're a huge partner for us. A number of life insurance companies, have business in Europe, and I think it's important for them to make these changes, and I think you'll see that happen. And similarly, I think in places like Japan, they're looking very closely at some of what's happening in the U.S. and again looking to see whether and how it should make sense for that market.
I think I saw on your LinkedIn you had stated. A robust capital market can be the greatest strategic asset the U.S. can offer.
Yeah.
How can you expand on that, and how key is the insurer role within that asset?
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree that, a strong capital market is a strategic resource for a country. And, we're blessed in the U.S. to have an incredibly strong and resilient capital market. We've shown that over the last 20 years since the financial crisis. And what that has allowed us to do is, it's given us a resilient U.S. economy, even when tested by COVID and, various bank failures. We've still shown growth, and we've still shown, sort of the ability for our economy to move forward. And that's increasingly important, not just for us, but for other economies in Europe and Asia. The reason being is, they're all looking at how do we build out our infrastructure? How do we build out our, green energy production? How do we fund national defense? How do we address the retirement crisis? And I think all recognize you cannot do that, strictly through the government spending. So you increasingly have to look at your capital markets. And I think Europe, as I mentioned, has looked at their capital markets and seen how it sort of, lags behind the U.S. in some ways, and have recognized that we actually need that as a strategic resource, because it's essentially the engine that allows them to then accomplish all of these other major policy objectives that every country has. So, and that's a point that we make to, insurance regulators particularly is, hey, since the financial crisis, you all have a, much bigger impact on the real economy than you did, pre-2008, because, more of that is now in private credit, more of which is being funded by life insurance. So you have to look at regulation through a very, sort of broad policy lens, because the decisions you all make, have impact on businesses large and small across the country. And so I think that message has resonated in the U.S. It's part of the reason I think have seen the NAIC adopt some of these changes is, they recognize they're playing a much more significant role than they ever have been before.
You referenced before the kind of that public-private dynamic, and over the last I think it was 25, 30 years, one of my previous guests had said it gone from 65 public, 35 private, and now it's flipped where it's 35 public, 65 private in terms of the split. Has that changed how insurance capital operates, how they're thinking of this dynamic?
Uh, you know, I hope not. I mean, risk lives in credit quality. Liquidity kind of just tells you how fast you can trade your mistake. And so liquidity really is just a feature. It's not a proxy for safety. And that's a point that we've been making for the last few years here. Again, is private does not equal risky. Public does not necessarily equal safe. A lot of that has changed over the last few years. I think you'll continue to see this melding of public and private. I mean, you have ETFs now for private. You have, liquidity trade delays on public. All of sort of the conventional wisdoms and assumptions, I think if you look closely, are being challenged. And I think, again, that's something for the policymakers and regulators to take note of. I mean, we've got lots of data that demonstrate that, sort of high investment grade private is as safe, if not safer than, sort of comparable public. And that's kind of this place where Athene and Apollo live is, investment grade private. And it's a place where we feel very good. And, and I think, again, we've gone through a number of periods just over the last 5 years between current market volatility and some of the other stresses we've talked about where, we've been able to test those assumptions around new thinking on public and private. And I think those assumptions have generally held up.
And I referenced your LinkedIn before, and certainly a theme I noticed when doing some research for this was your attention to mental health in the workplace. I mean, what more can be done to create a better balance? As I tend to work as a lot of people do on their phones, late at night, early in the morning. I mean, can we build in a better balance and a more healthier environment?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the question. And it is an area I'm passionate about. My wife is a mental health therapist. And so we have a lot of conversations on this topic. And, as both of us seen in stressed organizations, and goodness knows over the last decade between COVID and everything else, we've seen a lot of stress in our society that translate to stress in our business. And I think as leaders, we have to be aware of that and sensitive to that because, if your balance sheet is healthy, but your people aren't, you're only solvent on paper. You really have larger issues within your culture that, could ultimately bankrupt you, in a cultural sense. And so, again, it's part of the Athene culture that I'm particularly proud of. Our leaders are very committed to strong culture, to making sure that leaders are really responsible for their team. And I think it's just, especially in the sort of asset management, private equity space, it's a hard charging environment. I think a lot of us are wired for it and enjoy it to a degree, but, you have to keep life balanced and you have to keep yourself balanced. And again, we're responsible for sort of, parts of the machinery of the real economy. So you really want to make sure that the people, who are responsible for that are in a good place. So I think it is an area that, deserves more attention. And it does ultimately translate to your bottom line, right? I mean, if you have a disengaged workforce, your bottom line and your culture is going to reflect that.
So we have just a few minutes left. I like to end a little bit lighter as we wrap up here. So, a favorite sports team or hobby?
Favorite sports team. I'm a East Coast kid. Grew up loving the Philadelphia Eagles. Thankfully, they've had some good seasons. So that's my team. I still bleed green.
One surprising thing about yourself.
Interestingly, I lived when I was younger. My dad was military. We lived on a top secret military base in the middle of Wales in the UK. Had no idea until decades later that we lived in the midst of basically this top secret facility. But I wish I had realized that during the time. It probably would have made for a much cooler experience.
One book you would recommend to read.
So this is one my wife handed to me and started reading recently called 10X. It's just sort of how you really should, look for significant opportunities for improvement and transformation, not just small wins, but go for the big wins. And it talks about sort of how that creates a transformational culture and a change in mindset, where people really are striving for the very best, not just, sort of the little things. So very important, in the Athene and Apollo culture too. Go for the big wins.
Most exciting part of your job.
I think it's the engagement with global regulators, a number of whom are, friends and colleagues. And it's just being part of the discussion around this time of transformation that we are in. And I don't think, a lot of people really fully appreciate, somebody who's been around the marketplace for 30 years, what an exciting period we're in. So getting to talk about it and getting to be, sort of at the table as part of the discussions about how we design regulation around it. I mean, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to insurance regulation, but I love it.
And then final question, one prediction over the next 12 months.
I think over the next 12 months, again, you will see sort of this differentiation between private and public all but disappear. So we're going to have to come up with some new terminology.
Well, Mike, I appreciate you spending a few minutes with me here today. So thank you for your time. Continued, success to you, the team at, Athene and Apollo, and hopefully we'll get you back sometime in the future.
I would welcome that, Todd. Thanks. It's been great.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for coming back to the latest episode of the Credit Clubhouse. We are your one-stop shop for all things credit. We have an exclusive offer for our listeners. If you're interested in attending any of our conferences throughout the year, we have a great deal for you. Just head to www.DealCatalyst.io, pick the event you want to attend, and enter the promo code CREDIT at checkout. This will give you 10% off any ticket to any conference. As always, don't forget to follow the show, rate us, and leave a review.